Yep,
Thank you
yep.
for calling. What would you like to say?
I caught some of the conversations, a couple callers before me, but um, the I want to just refer to the gentleman that was just talking before me, and I just want to say first of all, I think the premise of reparations is a great thing, but um, there's a lot of things that are being said that um, there's things that are left out, and I feel like it's a constant narrative with Urban View, with a lot of things that I hear on here, and the people that call in, and I'm a white person, that like white people, the white folks, and that them damn white people and white women, and as far as reparations, and as far as the Atlantic slave trade, I mean, there's some important facts that, like, the caller before this left out. I mean, we know. I mean, it's a fact that a very large proportion of Africans that were taken from inland Africa and brought to the coast and sold were taken by other Africans. Like, it's important to like, that's not like a minute fact. And the other thing, like, the guy that just called said that this channel is an ecosystem of teaching our people about the possibilities, and not so much you, but I've tried to call many times to get on with Clay, and I
Let's stick to what we do here, because I don't
well,
speak to
I
how
feel like
other
I
hosts
feel
handle
like
this
it's
show. I'm gonna give you
I just
another
feel like
15 more seconds so you can land the plane, because
okay,
I
all
want to
right,
be
15
able
more
to
seconds.
respond.
I feel like I wish there would be more of a narrative to people of taking some responsibility, and not so much like you're just a victim, and white people are all bad, because I mean that's extremely offensive to someone like me,
So Blake,
and
how long have
people
you
like
been
my
listening to
family.
Urban View? How long have you been listening to Urban View?
I started listening to it. You know what? I'll tell you exactly when I started listening to it. I have XM radio, and I'm fanatical about news and getting all sides of news. And the first time I caught it, it was Clay was on, and he was talking about Stephen A. Smith had
Okay.
made some kind of statement about Trump,
About how long
and
ago was that? I'm just trying to get a sense
I,
as to how
so
long you've been
oh, okay,
listening.
okay. It probably was. I'm going to say like 4 or 5 months ago,
Okay,
and
all right. So
I don't like.
welcome to the Collin family. I got
Yeah,
it. We got to land the plane here
I,
because we got other folks
and
to
I,
get on, and
yeah, yeah, no,
actually have
and
a guest
I,
coming in.
but I just
So
want
I
to
just
how
want
I
to I want to respond to things
how
that
I
you've
was listening.
said, and then we'll
Okay, no, no, go
we'll
ahead.
move forward.
No,
I am. So you'd mentioned a couple of things that I think are really important. I appreciate you calling with the spirit of inquiry to try to get a sense of understanding, and I appreciate that. And so I'm going to respond in that same spirit, and I hope you can receive it in the energy in which it's given. So the idea that there was a couple things there that damn white people. Does that? I don't know that anyone has said that on Urban View. We do talk a lot about issues of race, gender, culture, identity, politics, and the law. I don't know that I've ever used the phrase, and these damn white people, I don't think I've ever used that phrase on these airways. And I'm sure you may have felt some sense of condemnation about the choices that many white Americans have engaged in, both as individuals and collectively. So I just want to push back a little bit on that. And you'd mentioned that there were some folks who had been introduced into the transatlantic slave trade vis-a-vis internal wars that were taking place in the continent of Africa. And I think that for a lot of people, that's where the story sort of starts and ends. And what we have to recognize is that slavery as a function of wartime is something that existed for millennia. The Greeks were doing it. The Germanic tribes were doing it. In fact, the word slave comes from Slavic, which speaks to the northern Europeans engaging in these processes. The Arab nations were doing it. African nations were doing it. And if you were engaged in war and your side lost, you were going to likely face enslavement as a possible outcome. Now, here's the challenge, Blake. We can't just stop the story there. So enslavement during that era was a function of societal hierarchies. And so one might be a slave, but one was still a human being. You might be a slave, but you might at some point be able to marry my daughter if I had captured you and your people in enslavement, because you were still considered a human being. You would be able to have children who would be your children. They wouldn't necessarily be my children. I wouldn't have agency over them. You would be able to explore the trades. You would be able to have some sense of capacity where you could earn on your own. And you would probably also be able to buy your own freedom because, again, your humanity was not taken. What was happening in the Americas, in the Western slave trade, when European Americans decided to abandon their European distinctions and came together under the label of white, they created this thing called chattel slavery. Now, chattel slavery was a brand new function. It's like going from the type of searching I did as a kid when I was looking at Encyclopedia Britannica and looking at paper books to get my research to going to Chat GPT AI sort of research. The gulf was that extreme. And in chattel slavery, you lost all humanity. In chattel slavery, you were no longer a human being who I happened to capture as a function of war. You were now no different than my cow, than my dog, than my rooster. I could force you into rape. I could rape you. I could force the children that were born from that rape to also be enslaved. And I didn't just own you. I owned you, your children, your children's 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 children, because slavery was never supposed to end. And I didn't just own your body. I owned your emotions. I owned your expressions. I owned everything that you produced. It was a fundamentally absolute different form of enslavement. It was the kind of enslavement that would allow for things like human trafficking. It was a kind of enslavement that would allow for things like laws that would say anyone who is born from a woman who is black, if she is impregnated by a white person, that child is enslaved. It was this type of slavery that would say you couldn't be educated. You weren't allowed to know things or to read things. You weren't allowed to have independent thoughts. You weren't allowed, if you were caught with a book, you could be killed. If you were caught trying to learn how to read, you could be sold away from your family. If you were looking at the master in a way that indicated you wanted something other than what the master wanted to do, you could lose your life. There were laws put in place that said 2 or 3 of you, no more, can gather before a white person has to be present to monitor the conversation. And then, Blake, the challenges. It wasn't like the enslavement of the old day. Whereas the enslavement of the old day, there were a few things that were able to happen, like eventually you'd no longer be a slave. That didn't happen here. Eventually, you were always going to be a slave. They created their entire economic system based on forced slave labor of millions of people who were human trafficked. That had never existed before. Chattel slavery had never existed before. And the other challenge that we face, Blake, is that you, as a white person, self-identified, still benefit from that, because not only did the racism that was used and created to justify enslavement not go away after enslavement, it amplified and it got entrenched. And they did things like after the Civil War, when the 13th Amendment was passed that said this chattel slavery is abolished, except if you've been convicted of a crime. And the reason they put that exception in there was because the white Americans who benefited from chattel slavery, which is, again, the newest form of slavery, had never existed before, as they benefited from that slavery, they could not imagine what it would mean to work on their own farms and produce for themselves. And so they began passing these laws called black codes, which were the same thing as the slave codes, but you couldn't call them slave codes anymore because technically slavery was over. So the black codes get passed. These were laws that only black people could be charged criminally with. And once you were criminally charged with violating a black code, like, I don't know, talking too loudly in front of a white person, or 5 or more black people gathering together without a white person present, or treating a white woman in a way that she didn't feel like she was being centered, or engaging in anything that a white person found offensive, you would then be convicted of that crime and then resentenced to enslavement. And so the reality is, when we're talking about slavery, we really do it a disservice by presuming that all of it is the same, and by starting and stopping the story at these arbitrary points that might make us feel good about what we do know without revealing all the things that we don't know. So Americans in particular, the Western powers in particular, did a really good job on completely revolutionizing enslavement and taking human people who, had they been enslaved somewhere else, would have kept their humanity, would have been able to become a part of society, would have been able to vote, would have been able to be a part of free thinking communities. In American slavery, the opposite was true. In slavery in the West, the opposite was true. And so that's why it's different. And so that's why, even to suggest, well, people were selling each other. Well, everybody was doing that. That wasn't the problem. The problem was when your ancestors made some decisions to amplify it and to change it fundamentally so that people were locked into a permanent caste system that was immutable. It would not allow for anyone to navigate out of that class system. And so that's one of the fundamental differences of enslavement between this current era and what was experienced in the medieval era prior thereto. Does that make sense, Blake?
history and don't know the things that you're telling me, what is that going to do? Tell me what's going to happen if we have federal reparations and give hundreds of thousands of dollars to just black people across the board in California, wherever. What do you think that's going to improve the things that you see?
What's not clicking? What's not clicking?
Well, Blake, I would suggest that you let us figure that out. We'll let you know what good it'll do. That's not a question for you. That's a question for so the person who is not impacted by the illness don't get to tell the doctor how to heal. We'll let you know what we're gonna do with it, and you'll be okay. And you'll still have white privilege. That's not gonna change. So you'll be fine.
That need the history lesson that you just gave me. That's the problem.
What's the problem?
You have people you have black people that do not know the history, the entire history lesson that you just gave to me.
Well, you must not be part. So again, we're not going to debate each other. We're not going to. Well, I should say we're not going to talk over each other. I would suspect you probably don't know that many black people in real life, because a lot of us know that history. In fact, you called into a show with a question that I was able to answer off the top of my head, and everything I shared with you wasn't new to the audience. We've been new. So I'm glad that you're listening. I'm glad you're learning this history for the first time. But the reason that you're learning the history for the first time is because your community has decided to largely self-segregate as individuals and as a collective. You ban books or don't fight for the books that are banned to not be banned. So you can't say we don't know the history when you participate either actively in the refusal to learn the history or passively by not resisting those who are actively trying to prevent the history. We've been new. And so we teach this to our kids. We learned it in our schools. We got whole ass curriculums that we done had scholars talking about this for 11 years. It ain't new to us. This is actually, I'm sure half my audience is yawning because they're like, child, we talking about this again. So I'm glad this is new information for you. Welcome to the Call-In family. I hope you keep listening and learning and growing, as are all of us. And we'll get it right most of the time. When we get it wrong, we correct the record. But this ain't new to us. We true to this. It might be new to you, but then again, you are new to this and to us. So there's that.